Chapter 16 of The World's Lumber Room by Selina GAYE. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. Animal Remains and Ancient Dust Heaps. Since the rocks forming the earth's crust have been deposited chiefly in salt water, as has been shown, it follows that the remains which they enclose will be mainly those of animals living in or near the sea. Remains of shells, corals, fish bones, saurians, etc., are naturally abundant, and so are fish scales, a modern deposit of which is to be found on the shore near Dundee, some 10 yards long and 2 or 3 feet thick. These are the scales of herrings, which fall off when the fishes are cleaned, and being very buoyant and comparatively indestructible, are thrown up by the waves. The case of land animals is altogether different, for with the vast army of hungry scavengers always on the watch, no dead body is likely long to escape being devoured if it remain exposed, and the circumstances under which it is likely to be buried and preserved are exceptional. Old land surfaces have occasionally been buried beneath sediment, and where this has been the case, animal remains are abundant. At times they may be covered by the mud and sand of inundations, at others by the sand which drifts in from the seashore, and at times animals are overwhelmed by landslips, or lost, and that in considerable numbers, in bogs and swamps, while in limestone districts they fall into fissures or wander into caverns where their bones may be covered with a crust of stalagmite. Mammal remains are most abundant in the sites of lakes into which the animals were, no doubt, carried by flooded rivers. Sheep and cattle are often washed away even in England in the springtime, and where rivers are larger, snowfalls heavier, and changes of temperature more sudden, large numbers perish at times and may be carried away to lakes, estuaries, or even the sea. During the great drought in the Pampas, several 100,000 animals rushed into the river Parana and perished from lack of strength to crawl up the muddy banks again. More than once the carcasses of above 1,000 wild horses were seen together, and as floods followed, large numbers of skeletons were probably buried in mud. Many animals seem to choose spots to which they retire to die. On the banks of the Santa Cruz there are places which are white with the bones of the guanaco. At St. Jago there is a retired corner to which the goats betake themselves, and everyone remembers the elephant cemetery in Ceylon to which Sinbad was conveyed. A dead elephant is never seen in that island, nor are its tusks or any portion of its skeleton found. The natives declare that the herd bury their deceased companions if these die before reaching the solitary valley to which they are supposed to withdraw on feeling the approach of death. Everyone believes in the existence of this valley, though it is mysteriously concealed from human eyes, and Sinbad recognised it at once when, on recovering his senses after his alarming journey, he "found himself among the bones of elephants, and knew that this was their burial place." Birds, having no such burial places and being less liable to be buried alive than other animals, are less frequently found fossilised. But when flying near volcanoes in a state of eruption, they have often been observed to drop down, killed by the noxious vapours, and if buried in fine volcanic ashes, not only their bones, but the form of their bodies would be preserved. Moreover, they sometimes fall into lakes when chased by hawks, and those which build near water are sometimes surprised and swept away by a flood, and in these cases, if they do not float long enough to be devoured, which being very light they probably do, they may chance to sink and be buried in mud. The chief remains of ancient birds are those of the large wingless kinds, whose bones were filled with marrow instead of air, which made their bodies considerably heavier and more likely to sink, while their want of wings put them on a level with other animals. The most extensive accumulations of organic matter due to birds are, however, the great guano beds of Peru, Bolivia, Africa, etc. 3/5 of the guano is soluble, so that 1 year of English weather would be enough to wash away many of the deposits entirely, and on the west coast of South America there is, owing to rain, no guano worth mentioning, except between latitude 13° north and 21° south, while the locality in which it is most plentiful and most valuable is the rainless region of South Peru. It is only recently that Europeans have learnt the value of guano, but under the Incas the birds were strictly preserved. Landing on the islands during the breeding season was forbidden on pain of death, and overseers were appointed to give their proper share of the valuable commodity to each claimant at the right time. In the Cincha Islands off Peru, the beds are 200 feet thick and the supply is almost inexhaustible. In addition to the droppings of countless seabirds which have resorted to these spots for centuries past, the guano is also partly composed of the skeletons and eggs of birds, and the bodies and bones of fishes and seals. It has undergone much alteration by internal chemical changes, and emits a strong smell of ammonia, and since it consists chiefly of phosphate of lime with soda, magnesia, and sulphur, it is a powerful fertilizer, and enables even the sandy desert around Lima to bear crops of maize. Ossite, or sombrero guano, is brought from a small island in the West Indies, which is entirely composed of the bones of turtles and other marine animals, together with coral sand, etc., which have been cemented into a compact mass by the droppings of birds. A magnificent crimson, called murexide, has been obtained from guano, while a fine purple has been found in the copros of serpents. The latter substance, which is very like plaster of Paris, was, and maybe still is, bought up at the rate of 9s. a pound from the Zoological Society by a doctor, or perhaps chemist. What he did with it was a mystery to most people, but no doubt he made the purpurate of ammonia from it. The well-known fossils called coprolites consist chiefly of phosphate of lime, and received their name because they were supposed to be the fossilised droppings of huge saurians, or lizards, and other animals. But though some are no doubt true coprolites, and all evidently result from the decay of animal matter, they have generally lost all trace of organic origin, and are simply nodules of bone earth, which, when ground or otherwise prepared, make a valuable manure. They are found in large quantities in the Suffolk Crag, along with the bones and teeth of whales, etc., and are washed up in such abundance on the beach that people are constantly engaged in collecting them. The beds vary from a few inches to several feet in thickness, and are found in Norway, the West Indies, Spain, and South Carolina, but were first dug in Cambridgeshire, where Dr. Henslow at once pronounced them to be bone earth, which, he said, "we are at our wits' end to get for our grain and pulse, and are importing as expensive bones from Buenos Aires." All animal matter contains a large proportion of carbon, and, as has been already mentioned, it seems probable that many deposits of rock oil are derived from the remains of fishes, molluscs, crustacea, and the other minuter forms of animal life, of which many shales, limestones, etc., are largely composed. The silicious flags of Caithness, for instance, are impregnated with oily matter, which is apparently due to the innumerable fishes embedded in them. Shells and the like are some of the most indestructible of animal remains, but having already spoken of the vast accumulations of chalk and lime to which they have given rise, we need only add that the soft, earthy carbonate of lime called marl, which is formed of freshwater shells and occurs in layers and patches from 1 to several feet thick in bogs and old lake sites, was at one time dug or dredged up as manure for the pastures. The importance of lime, and especially phosphate of lime, to many crops may be seen by a glance at the mineral composition of their ash. Thus the ash of meadow hay contains 11.6% of lime and 6.2 of phosphorus. That of winter wheat, 4.9 of lime and 7.4 of phosphorus, and that of red clover has 34% of lime and 9.9 of phosphorus. Shell sand, consisting of shelly, coralline, and other limy debris, is often applied to clay soils, especially by the French, who value it highly. And though 100,000 tons are taken every year from Padstow Harbour, it is so abundant that much more might be used. The name of fossil is given to all organic bodies, animal or vegetable, which have been naturally buried and more or less petrified or turned to stone. Many fossil shells are, however, scarcely at all altered, and some, even of the more ancient, still retain not only their mother of pearl, but even their colouring. In others again, as the animal matter or gelatin decayed, water containing some dissolved mineral has filtered in and filled up all the interstices. It may be with silica, or it may be with some metal, and the shell is thus more or less mineralised. Very often, when the mud in which a shell has been buried has become hard, the shell itself has been dissolved away, and all that remains of it is a cast of the interior in hardened mud or stone, and an impression of the exterior, with an empty space between the two. This empty space is again often filled with mineral matter, so that we have a perfect cast of the whole shell, inside and out. The beds known as greensands are, it is said, largely composed of the minute internal casts of foraminifera, whose tiny shells, before they dissolved away, were filled with silicate of iron and potash. About 2/3 of a bone consists of the earthy matter, phosphate, carbonate, etc., already mentioned. The remaining third is animal matter, a sort of gelatin, and as this decays, mineral matter may filter in, and the bone become petrified or mineralised. Both animal and vegetable substances may be mineralised to a certain extent in a few weeks, or even days, when steeped in mineral water. Occidental turquoise seems to be nothing more than fossil bone or ivory, coloured by the infiltration of phosphate of iron, while the true turquoise, which it resembles but does not equal, consists of phosphate of alumina coloured by copper. But there is another and more wonderful method of petrifaction, which is by no means uncommon, to which we have alluded in Chapter 12. In this, the shell, bone, or tree trunk is neither mineralised by infiltration, nor merely represented by a cast, but the whole of its organisation is faithfully reproduced. A cast may give one a perfect idea of the appearance of any object, as seen from within or from without, but cannot show its structure, whereas a model, which is what this sort of petrifaction produces, is an exact imitation. Each atom of the original substance is replaced by an atom of some other mineral. The most common replacement is that in which silica is substituted for lime, the former being, as we have seen, especially attracted by decaying matter. Strictly speaking, these fossils are not therefore organic remains, but perfect models of such remains. Some few extinct animals are represented, however, by more than fossils, and more even than bones. Early in the present century, the first mammoth, still covered with flesh, hair, and wool, was discovered in the ice by a Siberian fisherman, who possessed himself of its 2 great ivory tusks, which he sold for 50 roubles, and left the carcass for the white bears and dogs to feast upon. 2 years later, in 1805, the skeleton was still almost entire. The animal measured 16 feet in length and 9 in height, and from the long, stiff black bristles and coarse red-brown hair and wool still remaining, it was evident that it was a species of elephant fitted to live in cold regions. Long before it attracted the notice of naturalists, the mammoth had been known to the Siberian Ostyaks, who were so accustomed to finding the carcasses buried and preserved in the frozen ground that they firmly believed that the creatures lived there and only died when they smelt the air. Its long curved tusks they considered to be movable horns with which it dug its way through clay and mud. The Chinese knew it in very early times as the Tien Shu, or giant rat, a stupid, inert animal which, they said, avoids the light and lives in dark holes. And some of their learned men thought these earth rats might be the cause of earthquakes, which they could not otherwise satisfactorily account for. Even late in the 17th century, Father Avril, when travelling in Russia, was told that the ivory he saw was procured by men who ventured their lives in attacking the creature which produced it, which was as big and as dangerous as a crocodile. The Arabs seem to have been the first to develop the trade in fossil ivory, and from the corruption of their word behemoth we get mammoth. Immense quantities of the bones and horns of the fossil rhinoceros are also thrown up on the shores of the Polar Sea, and the inhabitants of the Siberian tundras, or swamps, believe them to be parts of a colossal bird with which they declare that sundry persons have had terrific fights. Footnote: the vast region of the tundras extends from 64° north latitude northwards to the coast. For 9 months of the year it is covered with ice. In the summer it is a swamp, producing nothing but moss. End footnote. The claw of a griffin was presented to Charlemagne, and the Russian merchants to this day never call the sword-shaped horns of the rhinoceros anything but grip claws. As gold sand is found in some places where these claws are buried, it is probable that the expression "taking gold from under the griffins" had its origin in this notion of the gigantic bird, which also may have been the ancestor of the gold-guarding dragons of fairy lore. Nowhere are the remains of both mammoth and rhinoceros more plentiful than in the lowlands adjoining the icy sea. Multitudes are buried between the Lena and Kolyma, and one of the New Siberian islands is little more than a mass of mammoth bones which have been worked for many years by the traders. One single sandbank has furnished the best harvest of tusks for 80 years past, and in 1844 Siberian ivory to the amount of £16,000 in weight was sold in St. Petersburg. At least 100 pairs of tusks are still sent to the market every year. Many limestone caves contain large quantities of animal remains, but stalagmite is not such a good preserver as ice, and nothing is left but bones, most of which are broken, rubbed, rolled, or polished as if they had been carried long distances by water. Often, no doubt, the animals were surprised by sudden torrents, carried into the caves, and buried in mud, over which a crust of stalagmite afterwards was formed. But often also they lived and died on the spot where their remains are found. At least 300 hyenas of different ages were buried in the Kirkdale Cavern in Yorkshire, which contains also the bones of wolves, bears, birds, etc., and as all the latter are gnawed, while the former are not, we may conclude that the cave was once the home of many generations of hyenas, and that the other animals were only dragged there to be devoured. In other caves, the bones of hundreds of cave bears, wolves, lions, tigers, as well as of the mammoth, have been similarly preserved in stalagmite to tell us something about the animal population of Europe in past ages. Other caves are, however, even more interesting than these, since they contain the dust-heaps, or kitchen middens, not of animals, but of men. The cave at Carrigagower in the county of Cork, for instance, shows us that it was inhabited in ancient times by people who lived to a large extent on beef, mutton, and pork, but had no more idea than the hyenas of keeping their dust-heaps outside their houses. They ate their food and threw the bones down on the mud floor, perhaps for their cats and dogs, whose remains are also found, and they stabled their horses in the cave with themselves. Sometimes they caught hares and rabbits, and they fed largely upon molluscs, especially limpets, periwinkles, and garden snails, whose shells are found in great numbers. The earlier inhabitants of the cave had stones for hammers and flint flakes for knives, but they were followed by others who were more civilized and possessed iron knives, an iron chisel, and a nail, and must have cultivated some sort of grain, since the upper stone of a quern or handmill has been discovered. In Denmark there are old dust heaps from 3 to 10 feet high, and from 100 to 1,000 feet long, which contain implements of stone, horn, bone, and wood, fragments of rude pottery, charcoal, cinders, and the bones of many animals, some of which, such as the beaver, do not now live there. On the coast of Peru, and a few miles inland, there are shell heaps more than 180 feet high and above 300 in diameter, which have been preserved from decay, partly by the growth of vegetation, and partly by a thick crust of carbonate of lime which has been formed on the surface by the action of the rain. These great heaps contain charcoal, ashes, stones blackened by fire, the bones of fishes and birds, especially parrots, splintered human bones, and stone axes, and are evidently the refuse remains of countless savage banquets. Similar shell heaps are found everywhere in the Fiji Islands. Others, which are probably relics of the Bushmen, occur at the Cape of Good Hope, and contain limpets so large as to be good drinking cups. In Australia, the shell mounds left by the natives are so large and numerous that white men have worked all their lives at sifting out the undecomposed shells to be burnt for lime. Crows and even vultures do something towards raising heaps of shells. Above 100 of the former have been seen together feeding on mussels, and Mr. Barrow says that on one occasion, in a cavern at the point of Mussel Bay, he disturbed thousands of birds and saw heaps of empty shells enough to fill some thousands of wagons. The ancient races inhabiting the pile dwellings, whose remains were first discovered about 30 years ago in some of the Swiss lakes, instead of piling their rubbish around them, which would have been inconvenient, threw it into the water, where enough has been preserved in the mud to give us a tolerably good idea of their manner of life. Piles were driven into the bed of the lake and connected by timbers, and upon this common platform each family had its own hut, with a trapdoor in the floor for the convenience of fishing, and no doubt also for getting rid of their rubbish. There must have been a large settlement on the Lake of Geneva, for the piles extend 1,200 feet along the shore and 150 feet into the lake. Many other colonies must have been of considerable size, for thousands of piles are found still firmly fixed in the mud, and at Wangen, on Lake Constance, more than 1,300 articles of stone, bone, and pottery have been recovered. The huts were made of twigs, woven together and plastered inside with clay, and the inhabitants had not only abundance of fishes, but the flesh of stags, goats, wild boars, and foxes, which last they seem to have eaten in great quantities, to judge from the number of bones. The earliest lake dwellers had none but stone implements, and were contemporary with the elephant and rhinoceros. Somewhat later we find that deer, wild boars, and wild oxen were still abundant, and later still a generation rose up which had learnt the use of metal, for their tools and implements were made of bronze, which is a mixture of copper and tin. As tin was from the very earliest times brought chiefly from Cornwall, we must conclude that the people of the Bronze period had some indirect dealings with the inhabitants of Great Britain, and therefore knew something of trade. Their pottery is much finer in texture and more elegant in shape than that of their predecessors, and they had made other advances towards civilization, having learnt to keep domestic animals, to eat beef, pork, and goat's flesh, to cultivate wheat and barley, and to weave cloth of flax and straw. They even wore necklaces, bracelets, hairpins, and safety pins, and they made a kind of bread of the wholemeal, or rather whole grain variety, the grains being roasted, slightly ground, and merely pressed into lumps. From the seeds and stones yet remaining, we find that they had plums, raspberries, and apples, and they also had hazel and beech nuts, whose shells, with all their other refuse, they threw into the water, never dreaming that centuries and even thousands of years after they themselves were gone, it would be brought to light and examined with the deepest interest by the learned men of a new era. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The World's Lumber Room by Selina GAYE. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17, Household Refuse. Nature's scavengers are not perfect, but the result of their labours on the whole is that where nature is left to herself, not only is nothing wasted, but refuse of all kinds is so speedily disposed of that we seldom come across anything to disgust either sight or sense of smell. Where man comes on the scene, indeed, the case is different. But nature can no more be expected to dispose of his refuse for him than to feed and clothe him and provide for his other wants, though he oftentimes leaves a great deal to her, and owes her, as Miss Staveley reminds us, always far more than he is generally aware of. Certainly in the matter of scavenging, man does not compare favourably with nature, for she knows nothing of the accumulations of filth and rubbish with which he is puzzled to deal. And after watching her labourers at their work, it is rather humiliating to glance at a dust-yard and be compelled to own, as one must, that she manages matters in a much neater and altogether less offensive way than we do. Throughout the East, scavenging, even in the towns and villages, is left chiefly to her good offices, as we have seen, and many a village on the hills about the Bosphorus owes such cleanliness as it possesses to the occasional heavy falls of rain. In Ceylon, the Chandalas, who belonged to the lowest caste, were degraded to the office of scavengers and carriers of corpses. And in the legends of Buddha, the Chandala is represented as one born in the open air, his parents not being possessed of a roof. He lies among the pots when his mother goes to cut firewood. And, says Manu, he can never be relieved from bondage or emancipated by a master. In 437 BC, the Nietzsche Chandalas are specially named as cemetery men. But a couple of centuries later, cremation had been introduced, and their services were no longer required in the cemeteries. Not very much above the Chandala in the social scale come the Paris chiffonniers, who form a class as much apart from the rest of the community as if they were separated by the laws of caste. The chiffonnier, or ragman, no more confines his attention exclusively to rags than the dustman does to genuine dust. He is a by no means romantic or attractive-looking individual, and it is difficult at first sight to understand why he should be such a favourite character with French novelists, and how he acquired the halo of romance which surrounds him at the present day. According to the popular legend, every chiffonnier is a nobleman, or at least a gentleman, in disguise, or perhaps a learned professor who has met with reverses, or has other reasons for shunning the society of his equals. But the chiffonnier would never have held this position in the public imagination had he, like the dustman, pursued his unsavoury occupation in broad daylight. It is his little dark lantern, and the fact that he does not emerge from his place of retirement until nightfall, which have combined to make him such an object of mystery and interest. Like his Italian brother, and like most of the scavengers employed by nature, he appears with the owls and bats, prowls about in the deserted silent streets at the most unearthly hours, and when the sun rises he vanishes into his own quarter of the city and is seen no more till night returns again. We, who are accustomed to seeing the dust carts on their daily rounds, may well wonder what the chiffonnier can find in the streets to fill his wicker basket, and our wonder will increase when we learn that, according to the official returns, 7,050 men and women make their living in this way in Paris, and earn, some of them, as much as 3 francs a day. The fact is that as regards its scavenging, the elegant city of Paris has not hitherto been much in advance of Constantinople or Cairo. All the dust and refuse of the houses was simply thrown out into the street. This was also the case in Rome until of late years. Where the chiffonnier rummaged in it at his leisure with an iron hook, or a stick having a crooked nail at the end, carrying off all that he could in any way turn to account, and leaving only the refuse of the refuse to be cleared away by the carts, or devoured by rats, hundreds of which may be seen running about the streets in all directions late at night. Of late, however, he has been thrown into great consternation by an order from the prefect of the city, who considers that it would be more conducive to health and cleanliness if the dust of each house were collected in some receptacle and put outside in the morning to be emptied into the dust carts when they make their rounds. This plan is followed in Boulogne and several British towns, and has great advantages over the system of dustbins, since the refuse is removed daily before it has time to decay and become injurious. And as the dustmen have merely to empty the tub or box, the dust of a whole street can be carried away in the time which it now takes them to empty a few dustbins. However, Paris has raised a great outcry against the new regulation, for reasonable as it is, it means little less than ruin to the poor chiffonnier. When the dust is simply thrown into the street, he can poke about in it easily, and soon pick out all that he cares to take. But if it were all collected in a deep tub or such like receptacle, it would be long before he could ascertain what treasures might be hidden in its depths, and could make sure that he was not leaving anything valuable behind. And then, worse than all, the time for making these minute investigations would not be allowed him, for the dust would not be put out of the houses until the morning, and the carts would come and take it away before he had even a chance of completing his search. The chiffonnier's principal treasures are bones, rags, paper, scraps of copper, sardine cases and other tins, and broken glass. And of these, 200 weights, about 100 kilos, of bones bring him 4 francs. The same weight of paper from 1 to 5 francs, according to the quality. Woolen rags, 40 francs. Copper, 80 francs. Tins, 3 francs. White glass, 6 francs. And green bottle glass, 1 franc 20 centimes, or about a shilling. A franc is worth 9pence halfpenny of English money. Cigar ends are also carefully collected and converted into régie cigarettes. Money, jewellery, and the like he is expected to give up to the concierge or porter of the house opposite which he has found it, and he bears a high character for honesty in this respect. The sardine and other tins, of which such thousands are thrown away, go to support a branch of industry which is deeply interesting to the youthful part of the population, for after being stamped into shape by machines of simple construction, they reappear in the form of countless armies of tin soldiers, which are sold at prices so low that the manufacturer could not possibly afford to buy his raw material new from the tin man. Rag picking is a calling which anyone is free to pursue, but still the fraternity have their rules and regulations, and are divided into well-marked ranks. Lowest of all are the biffins, or chineurs, who are half desperadoes and half amateurs, people who are something else by day and go out fortune-seeking in a random, irregular way at night. They are not in favour with the other chiffonniers, for they either do not know or do not respect the customs of the society, and being apt to encroach on other people's rights, are looked upon as bunglers and dabblers, a disturbing element, in fact, calculated to throw the well-regulated machinery of the body out of gear. The rouleurs are more respectable than these, and have each their own particular districts in which they make their rounds. They do not trespass on their neighbours' property, and expect to have their own hunting grounds treated with equal respect. The placiers occupy the highest rank of all, and as the aristocrats of the brotherhood have the privilege of overhauling the dust before it is turned out into the street. The concierge, who knows them well and treats them with benevolent condescension, allows them even to come into the house and pick the dust over undisturbed. A placier will visit from 10 to 30 houses in this way, and in return for the indulgence shown him will fetch water or do any other little service for the concierge. His place is worth something in a wealthy neighbourhood, and when he retires from the business he sells it to his successor, who makes his first appearance with him one Sunday morning in a tidy suit of clothes, and is formally introduced to all the concierges on his beat, and is recommended to their kind consideration. It is said that some placiers have paid as much as 1,000 francs for their business. Besides the chiffonniers of these three classes, there are, above them again, the contractors, who buy the refuse of them, have it sorted by day labourers, and then sell it again in large quantities. There are about 100 such contractors in Paris, and of these 4 or 5 turn over millions of francs in the course of the year. Many are very wealthy, and all soon become well-to-do. There is a certain Monsieur Berton who has made himself conspicuous in the Paris elections since 1868 by offering himself as a candidate, printing his addresses on rose-coloured paper, and promising prosperity to mankind in general, and the Parisians in particular, if only they will give him a seat in the Chamber of Deputies or on the Municipal Council. This gentleman was for 20 years a dust contractor, and retired from the business when still comparatively young, with a yearly income of 60,000 francs £2,040, earned for him by the rouleurs and placiers. The chiffonniers live in certain streets, which are occupied by members of the fraternity only. The best known of these is Rue Mouffetard, on the left bank of the Seine, but there are also large colonies at Montrouge, Montmartre, and La Villette, and everywhere their habitations look more like gipsy camps than anything else. Their huts are built of the most extraordinary materials, the walls being either of kneaded mud or, like those of the ancient lake dwellers, of wattle filled in with clay. A carriage wheel often does duty for a window, the spaces between the spokes being covered with oiled paper, and the roof consists of tarpaulin, or at best of pieces of roofing paper patched together. Some few buildings are constructed of brick, gypsum, or wooden spars, but these are owned only by the very prosperous. Great cleanliness is, of course, out of the question, considering the nature of the goods which are piled up in and around the huts until they are sold. But the chiffonnier is personally less dirty than might be expected, and his health is as good as that of other poor people. Most of the fraternity have been chiffonniers all their lives, for the calling is hereditary in certain families, and has been so for so many generations that the chiffonniers form a distinct caste, speaking, as Mr. Symonds says, not a word of real French. They have to work hard, making usually 2 journeys every night from the outskirts to the heart of the city. They have to turn night into day, and to carry heavy loads, and they must go out whatever the weather may be. But if their earnings are but moderate, they are, at all events, regular, and much more certain than those of many callings which rank far higher in the public estimation. They are always on very good terms with the police, and though they may be said to be almost outside the pale of civilization, are usually of no religion, and live and die without having any very certain civil standing, still crimes are almost unknown among them, and they are some of the most peaceable and orderly inhabitants of the unquiet city of Paris. They have never taken any part in the frequent revolutions. They kept tranquil during the Commune, and, it is said, went their nightly rounds and calmly picked their dust-heaps, even during that fearful week in 1871, when one part of the beautiful city was in flames, and Versaillists and Communards were fighting like savages in other quarters. In England we have no one who at all answers to the chiffonnier, but we have the rag, bone, and bottle man, the rabbit and hareskin man, The hawker who takes old clothes and old hats in exchange for pots of flowers and crockery. And we are told that there are nearly 1,000 persons who make their living by selling second-hand articles in the streets of London alone. Much might be said on the subject of old clothes, the largest dealers in which do so large a trade that they are known as merchants, and export their goods to all parts of the world. Long before the French Revolution, it was an established custom that there should be an annual sale at the Tuileries of all the discarded garments belonging to the royal family, the proceeds of which were ostensibly given to the poor. The practice was revived by the Empress Josephine, and continued through all the various changes of dynasty until the establishment of the present republic. A long gallery in the basement of the palace, looking into the garden, was fitted throughout its whole length with oak wardrobes, which were usually well filled in the course of the year. When the time for the sale came, the shutters were closed, the gallery was brilliantly lighted up, and visitors were admitted by invitation cards issued by the attendants of the Queen or Empress. Every article was ticketed with its price, from which, of course, there was no deviation. But the chief part was generally bought up by the valets and women of the wardrobe, and they disposed of all that remained unsold to the great dealers, who again sold the goods to their customers at immense prices. Many are the vicissitudes of old clothes, many are the hands through which they pass, whether given away or sold, and with every change they drop a little lower in the social scale, becoming shabbier and shabbier, until at last, when they will hold together no longer, they are sold as rags, and forthwith enter upon a fresh career. The trade in old clothes is almost entirely in the hands of Jews, whose great mart is in Houndsditch. Some articles are sold just as they are, others are mended, patched, translated, and made to look like new. The skirts of a coat, being the part least worn, are easily converted into children's clothes, but old black cloth always has a certain value even when too far gone to make miniature waistcoats or knickerbockers. France takes the best of it to make up into caps, and that which is still more threadbare is bought up for the same purpose by Russia and Poland. The black velvet waistcoats, still worn as best by certain classes, are converted into skullcaps for German and Polish Jews. The bulk of our old clothes goes to Holland and Ireland, but the vast majority of the scarlet coats worn by officers in the army are said to find their way to the annual fair held at Leipzig. Regimentals, smart liveries, robes of office, etc., are greatly admired by the natives of the west coast of Africa, and many of them are therefore dispatched thither. But the red tunics of the British infantry are chiefly bought by the Dutch, who make them into under waistcoats which are worn next to skin by every careful working man, since they are believed to be effectual in keeping off rheumatism, a matter of no small importance in their watery country. Footnote: until recently, soldiers have been allowed to dispose of old uniforms as they pleased, and have been careful of their clothes accordingly, knowing that the better their condition, the better price they would fetch. At Aldershot, the old clothes dealers used to drive a very satisfactory trade, but disused uniforms have now to be returned in accordance with an order to that effect to the authorities. End footnote. The grey overcoats of the infantry are sold at the Cape and in our own agricultural districts, where they are bought especially by the shepherds. The heavier and more valuable cloaks of the artillerymen are bought by the Dutch, and Holland and Ireland together are the purchasers of all the police uniforms. A hat is an article which possesses a certain value as long as it will hold together and keep any shape at all. And it is wonderful what may be done with a battered old chimney pot by means of cutting down, relining, brown paper, glue, rabbit fur, dye, and varnish. By judicious treatment, the old hat may be made to look, for a time at least, like a smart new one, and as long as it is worn only in fine weather, the purchaser will no doubt congratulate himself on his bargain. But the first shower will reduce the whole fabrication to a shapeless mass, and he will probably regret the 3 francs which he has spent on the purchase. It is the French Jew who is especially clever at dealing with old hats, which he buys from the chiffonnier at 8 sous a piece, and sells at a considerable profit for the sum above mentioned. "Stockings! You can get as good stockings as anybody wants for 3/8 a pair," says a poor woman living in Holborn. "They gives a penny a pound for stockings at the rag shop, and sells them at a 1/8 a leg, and if you buys 3 legs you can make a first-rate pair of stockings good enough for anyone." But there comes a time in the existence of old clothes, whatever the rank of life in which they started, when they are too old and patched and faded and threadbare either for the dealers or the pawnbrokers. In fact, they are no longer clothes, but rags, and in this condition they find their way to the rag shops, either directly or through the medium of the dust cart. It has been stated that not more than 2/5 of the rags in England are preserved, and manufacturers are consequently obliged to import large quantities, an expense which might be entirely spared to the country if people were more thrifty. The London Ragged School at one time started some of its boys with 4 trucks, with the result that in 9 months they had collected 82 tons of rags and other refuse, and 50,000 bottles. It is reckoned that each 600 houses would well supply 1 truck. But the Lancashire famine diverted all the rags in another direction, and the attempt to collect them does not seem to have been made again. In former days every thrifty housewife had a rag bag, into which were put not only rags but all the snippings which result from the process of cutting out, and are now too often consigned to the fire. Some countries altogether forbid the export of rags, and our chief supplies are drawn from Italy and Germany, of which we are large customers. All old woollen clothes come to the soil at last, being extremely valuable as manure. The early broccoli grown in the west of Cornwall thrive better on woollen rags than on anything else, and hops of a certain quality cannot, it is said, be grown without them. But good rags are so valuable for other purposes besides these, that it is chiefly the seams and other unusable parts which are put away to rot and then sent to the Kentish hop fields. But for the fact that old wool can be used again, all our woollen goods would be double the present price, for 1/3 of the manufactures of this country are supplied by shoddy and mungo, that is, wool and worsted, no matter how old, which are reduced to their former state and then rewoven. In 1882 we imported 37,511 tons of woollen rags, at a cost of £820,616. Most of them are bought up by Dewsbury and 2 or 3 neighbouring towns, where they are torn to pieces by sharp spikes and worked up into cheap cloth for the slaves of South America, or respun with the addition of new wool and manufactured into all kinds of woollen goods. The devil's dust, as it is called, after the machine employed for this purpose, which is produced by the tearing up of the rags, befouls the whole town of Dewsbury, and is so injurious to the workpeople engaged in the factories that they are obliged to keep their mouths muffled. Some of the rags are ground to powder, variously coloured, and used for the making of flock papers and artificial flowers. Some are taken by the paper mills and made into blotting and other papers of an absorbent character, and some again, after being boiled with pearl ash, horns, hoofs, hoof and hide clippings, blood, old iron, waste leather, etc., reappear in the form of yellow crystals of prussiate of potash used in dyeing, and from this again the beautiful colour known as Prussian blue is manufactured. Rags of all kinds are in great demand for the paper mills, many of which use more than 30 tons a week. All are welcome, whether silk, wool, linen, cambric, lace, holland, fustian, corduroy, bagging, canvas, and even, though these cannot be called rags, old ropes. In fact, almost any species of tough fibre, even the roots and bine of hops, vine tendrils, cabbage stalks, and straw, may be made into paper. Straw alone makes the paper too brittle to be serviceable, unless the silica contained in it be destroyed, but it is frequently mixed with other materials. Still, it is not probable that anything will ever lessen the value of rags, since they must needs go on accumulating and being disposed of in one way or another, and are, therefore, to be had cheaper than anything else. Before they come to the mill, it is necessary that the rags should be sorted, that the paper maker may know exactly of what the bulk is composed, and determine its destination accordingly, old rope being made into coarse brown paper, and the refuse of the flax mills into tracing paper, while the paper for bank notes is made from the best white linen. Footnote: the tunics of the Jewish priests are said to have been unravelled and used as wicks for the lamps during the Feast of Tabernacles. End footnote. In 1882 we imported 21,200 tons of linen and cotton rags of very various degrees of cleanliness, those from Italy being lowest in the scale, while some of the English ones are said to be so clean as to require no bleaching. Rags have one advantage, besides their cheapness, over all other materials, in that the repeated washings which they have undergone while in use as wearing apparel are an excellent preparation for their conversion into paper. The first thing done with them is to open all the seams, take out any stray pins and needles, and remove buttons, which might injure the machinery or spoil the quality of the paper. Women are employed in this part of the business, and they stand before horizontal frames covered with very coarse wire cloth, and having a large knife fixed upright in the centre, with the blade turned away from them. The bulk of the rags are cut up by machinery, but those intended for very fine paper are cut by hand into small pieces about 4 inches square, by being drawn across the edge of the knife. Much of the dirt and sand passes through the wire cloth into a drawer below during this process. The remainder is beaten out by machinery, and the rags are then boiled with soda and lime. Clean white rags are said to yield from 65 to 80% of their weight in paper. Statistics for 1884 show that there were in that year 3,985 mills in the world, which together produced nearly 17.5 million hundredweights of paper, of which the newspapers use about 1/3. But the rags have not come to an end of their career when worked up into paper, for the paper itself may be used over and over again, and clean waste paper yields from 75 to 80% of its weight in new paper. No paper, we are told, need be wasted, since it has been found possible to remove even the stain of printing ink. But still, no doubt, far more is consumed by cook and housemaid in the lighting of fires than is at all necessary. A whole newspaper seems to be considered a by no means extravagant allowance for one fire by some people, though it would light much better with 1/4 the quantity, or even less. There are many shops where newspapers are bought at the rate of a penny a pound, which seems to be a protest against waste. But it must be confessed that there is not much encouragement to people to save their waste paper at present, in spite of the alluring advertisements offering to buy it up. In the country, where space is less valuable, room may be found for 2 or 3 sacks, perhaps, in an outhouse, and then it may be worth while to send them periodically to paper mills or other buyers. But in London 1 sack is about as much as most people can accommodate, and for this 2 or 3 shillings, repayable when the sack is returned, have to be deposited. It takes a long time really to fill a sack, and when filled and fetched away, it not unfrequently happens that a note is received saying that the value of the paper just balances the expense of fetching it, and this even when the distance is less than a 10 minutes' walk. People who have had such an experience as this, which is not uncommon, will certainly not care to take the trouble of making another collection, or to give up the space needed for the sack. but no doubt many would be glad to give away the accumulations from their waste paper baskets, etc., if only someone would call for them periodically. Meanwhile, however, large quantities of waste paper do find their way back to the paper mills, to be remade either into paper or papier-mâché, in which latter manufacture no paper of any kind comes amiss. Tons of old account books, bankers' books, and of ledgers, cuttings of bookbinders, of pasteboard makers, of envelope and pocket-book makers, of print sellers, of paper hangers, etc., are disposed of for this purpose, and reappear as cornices, picture frames, bulkheads, cabin partitions, pianoforte cases, chairs, tables, etc., not to mention the thousands of little fancy articles which are made of papier-mâché. There are three kinds of papier-mâché: a sort of pasteboard in which sheets of paper are merely pasted together, which is much used for tea trays; a more solid kind in which the paper is pressed until it becomes hard enough to take a polish; and a third variety in which the paper is reduced to a pulp, in which condition it may be moulded into any shape that may be desired. Paper, in the form of papier-mâché, is daily being applied to fresh uses. Not long ago a daily paper announced that a factory chimney had been made of it. In America it has been used for the rails of railroads, the pulp being, it is said, as solid as metal, much more durable, and less influenced by atmospheric changes than iron or steel. Pasteboard wheels, made of equal parts of wood pulp and straw, have been used exclusively for many years past by the Pullman Palace Car Company. Much waste paper finds its way to the dust contractor's yard, where it becomes the property of the moulder, at least in some yards, for the regulations are not quite the same everywhere. The moulder is the foreman of the yard. He pays the sifters himself, and makes his own profits out of the paper, rags, bones, glass, iron, metal of all sorts, string and corks. The contractor has the hard and soft core and the coals and cinders. The hard core, consisting of broken crockery, earthenware, oyster shells, etc., is sold for road making, but is now frequently unsaleable and has to be got rid of at a loss. The soft core, consisting of all sorts of organic matter, refuse from fish shops, greengrocers, etc., is sold for manure, and the veritable dust or soil, which is as fine as gunpowder, is said to be especially useful for cultivating marshlands and clover, and was at one time so much sought after by farmers that shiploads of it were brought from the north. Some of it is also bought by the brickmakers to mix with clay. Rags are not sorted in the yard, but sold in the lump to a Jew. The largest cinders and the coals are bought by laundresses and braziers, the smaller, called breeze, by the brickmakers, who use them as fuel to burn between the layers of bricks. In some yards the sifters are allowed to take wood, corks, and a daily quantity of cinders as their perquisites, the allowance of the latter being so liberal that little markets are frequently held at the entrance to the yard, where the poor of the neighbourhood come to buy cheap fuel. In some places the women are also allowed pill-boxes and gallipots, and any crockery that can be matched and mended, and they may also appropriate the skins of dead cats. Cat skins are worth from 4d. to 6d., the highest price being given for white skins. They are used not only as fur, dyed or undyed, but are made into a sort of velvet which has a very good appearance, and cat and rabbit skins are also converted into felt hats. The fashion of fur tippets has, in all likelihood, considerably raised the value of skins. Hare and rabbit skins do not usually find their way into the dustbin, but are bought up by dealers in this particular kind of refuse. People in England do not make nearly as much use of them as their neighbours, and export 2/3 of them, that is, 8 or 9 million a year, to Germany, France, and Belgium. Hare skins are much valued as chest preservers, and fetch from 18 shillings and 6d. to 28 shillings the hundred. Dust sifting is necessarily a very rough and dirty occupation, but the wages are not bad, being from 8s. to 10s. a week in money, besides the perquisites, and the health of the dustwomen is said to be exceptionally good. In one large yard, during the prevalence of cholera and smallpox, not a single person engaged there was even attacked. The constant living in the open air, and the fact that they are obliged to use a good deal of soap and water, no doubt has much to do with their good health. Corks are recut or used in the making of Kamptulicon floorcloth. In Paris, old corks are collected from the Seine, washed, recut, and sold at a few sous the hundred. Waste cork, that which is too rough for cork making, finds its use as floats for fishermen and the stuffing of horse collars. Old boots and shoes go first to the translators, who patch them till they can be patched no more, and then they are boiled down into glue. A daily paper some time since gave curious statistics on the subject of old boots and shoes, which had been brought to light in the course of inquiries instituted in New York by the superintendent of the census. In New York and Brooklyn, about 3 million pairs of old shoes are thrown away every year, and used to be plentiful in the gutters in some parts. They have now become scarce, however, as they are diligently picked up and used for 3 purposes. Those which are not too far gone are patched and greased and sold to the people who deal in such goods. Many folk wear one shoe much more than the other, and the dealers find pairs for the odd ones. The shoes not worth patching are cut up, and the good bits are used for patching other shoes, while all the worthless parts are converted into Jamaica rum by a process known only to the manufacturers. It is said they are boiled in pure spirits and allowed to stand for a few weeks, and that the product far surpasses rum made in the ordinary way. Broken glass of all kinds always finds a ready market, and may reappear on our tables over and over again, for in making glass it is usual to melt the materials together with a quarter or half their weight of cullet, or broken glass, of the same kind, so that many 100 tons are wanted in the course of the year. Of late, moreover, the coarsest kinds of broken glass have had another destiny opened up to them, being bought by a manufacturer, Mr. Rust, who melts them down, colours the paste any tint he chooses by a secret process of his own, and when it is cold, breaks it into irregular fragments of various sizes, with which he produces very effective mosaics for the decoration of shops and other buildings, and as the materials are cheap, he is able to sell them at prices much below those at which any other mosaics can be bought. Broken bottles are also ground up to make glass paper. The common kinds are made of the coarsest materials, of which rough sand and soap as waste are some of the principal. Dirty water and soap suds from laundries are used for watering gardens, or the grease is recovered and turned into soap again. The water in which fleeces have been washed yields fatty salts called swint, from which potash salts are made, and also soap used in scouring woollen manufactures. Bones are the only other considerable item which come under the head of household refuse. In Russia they are either exported or simply wasted, that is, so far as man is concerned, being left to nature to dispose of at her leisure. In more civilized countries they are put to a variety of uses, the majority of them going first to the bone boilers to have the animal matter, oil and gelatin, extracted. Simply ground to dust, they form a valuable manure, and are imported in quantities from Australia in the shape of bone dust tiles. As bone meal, they are used for feeding cattle. At a large dyeing establishment in Manchester, bones are boiled for the sake of the gelatin, or size, which is used for stiffening goods. The fat is sold to the candle makers, and size, liquor, and bones are bought for manure. After boiling and bleaching, processes which render them more brittle than before, bones may go on to the turner to be made into knife handles, tooth and nail brushes, buttons, and the like. Bone black, or animal charcoal as it is popularly but improperly called, is made by burning bones in closed vessels. From it is made the ivory black of the artist, and it is also used in the manufacture of blacking. Bone charcoal is employed for refining sugar, and is so absorbent that it will take all the colour out of treacle, or sugar water coloured with indigo, leaving them quite white. The charcoal may be used over and over again by washing and heating, and when finally exhausted for refining purposes, is used for manure and the manufacture of phosphorus. A word must be said about the old tin and ironware, kettles, pots and pans, etc., which are sometimes consigned to the dustbin. The tin soldier business seems to be confined to the Continent. In England, the best parts of an ancient tin kettle are clipped out, cut into shape, punched with holes, blacked and varnished, and used to strengthen the edges and corners of cheap trunks. Old iron may, of course, be melted down, but before this happens it frequently takes a voyage as ballast, and large shiploads of frying pans, gridirons, saucepans, candlesticks, tea trays, boilers, shovels, old corrugated iron roofing, the produce of the old iron shops, and the findings of the Thames mudlarks, are sent off to the United States and the Continent. Our exports of this description reached 132,033 tons in 1882, and were valued at £507,161. Saucepans and frying pans naturally lead one to think of food, and in concluding our notice of household refuse, we may mention a curious market held at the Halles Centrales in Paris for the sale of broken meat of all kinds, which was described at length by the correspondent of the London Daily Telegraph in 1878. Quote, "The fragments which form the jewellery of the Halles Centrales are brought down in big baskets between 7 and 8 every morning by the garçons of the great boulevard restaurants, or by the larbins from the hotels of the ministers or the foreign ambassadors." End quote. If a grand dinner has been given the night before at one of the embassies, the show of jewellery in the morning will be magnificent. There will be whole turkeys and fowls, hams and boars' heads which have been scarcely touched, displayed upon the deal boards. Out of the season, the supply comes chiefly from the leading restaurants, where the leavings are the perquisites of the waiters. Some dealers, and they are nearly always women, have a yearly contract with particular restaurants. Some arrange the goods themselves, others, feeling that it is a matter of importance and that they do not possess the requisite taste and skill, engage a professional hand to do it for them. The object, of course, is to make a very little seem a great deal, and also to render the various portions as attractive to the eye as possible. And the artists flit from stall to stall, giving here and there a touch of green in the shape of spinach or Brussels sprout, or of red in the form of carrot or tomato, adding a morsel of blancmange here, a bit of pie crust there, and so on, until each portion looks as it should. The portions are arranged on quarter sheets of old newspapers, and vary in price from 2 sous upwards. As a sample, imagine a pile consisting of the leg of a partridge, the remnants of an omelette, the tail of a fried sole, 2 ribs of a jugged hare, a spoonful of haricot beans, a scrap of fillet, a cut pear, a handful of salad, a slice of tomato, and a dab of jelly, all to be had for 5 sous or 2d halfpenny. The purchasers are not the cheap eating houses, as has been supposed, but the quiet poor, people who are ashamed to beg, and but for the merciful cheapness of these appetizing scraps, would not taste meat from one month's end to another. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The World's Lumber Room by Selina GAYE. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18. Miscellaneous Refuse. What one generation neglects collects, wastes, even pays to get rid of, another finds to be valuable property, and a history of the utilisation of refuse would be almost a history of civilisation. One of the most notable examples of the way in which the refuse of one generation makes the fortune of the next is to be found in the history of the gas companies. When gas has been separated from coal, there remains in the retort first solid coke, which represents most of the carbon contained in the coal, and is so hard as to be able to cut glass, like its near relation, the diamond. Secondly, there is a certain amount of tarry matter and watery liquid. The latter, which is called gas water or ammonia water, is a brownish liquid with a strong smell, and yields salts of ammonia, from which spirit of hartshorn is made. But the coal tar? Previous to 1856, it was worth hardly a halfpenny a gallon in London, while in the country the gas makers were glad to give it away. Yet now, whereas 9,000,000 tons of coal at 12 shillings are worth but £5,400,000, the waste products on this amount, after the gas has been extracted, are, according to Dr. Siemens, actually worth £8,370,000. Footnote: 9,000,000 tons of coal at 12 shillings, £5,400,000. Waste products on this amount: colouring matter for dyes, 3,350,000; sulphate of ammonia, 1,947,000; pitch, 365,000; creosote, 208,000; carbolic acid, 100,000; gas coke, £2,400,000, making a total of £8,370,000. End footnote. The fact is that the coal tar, which the gas makers were so anxious to get rid of at any price or no price, has been discovered to contain many most valuable substances, among which are the white crystalline acid called carbolic, now universally used as a powerful disinfectant; naphthalene, which crystallises in white pearly plates; the colourless liquid called benzole; and white, waxy-looking paraffin. All these are hydrocarbons, and as we have already seen that the essential oils to which plants owe all their sweet scents are also compounds of carbon and hydrogen, it may not surprise us to hear that the perfume of woodruff, melilot, Tonquin bean, and many others can be obtained from gas tar, which also yields the peculiar odour of jargonelle pears used in flavouring cheap confectionery, and oil of bitter almonds. From benzole is obtained another colourless liquid called aniline, which is now manufactured on a very large scale, as, when mixed with other things, it produces the brilliant colours extensively used for dyeing silk, woollens, and other goods, and for printing calicoes. Not long ago the Corporation of Antwerp used to spend £1,000 a year in getting rid of the refuse of the town, whereas now they sell their street sweepings and sewage for £40,000. Some years ago, when English miners from Cornwall arrived in Chile, they were astonished to find the natives throwing away as useless the copper pyrites which they knew to be so valuable, this being the common form in which copper ore is found in Cornwall. But the Chileans were so certain that it contained no copper at all, that they not only laughed at the ignorance of the English, but sold them their richest veins for a few dollars. Then again, the cinders from the old furnaces were thrown away as utterly useless, and it was actually found worth while to transport them to England, where by stamping and washing, particles of copper were recovered in such abundance as to amply repay the purchasers. Soda ash, or sodium carbonate, is a substance manufactured in England on an enormous scale, and used for glass making, soap making, bleaching, and various other purposes. Formerly it was prepared from barilla, i.e. the ashes of sea plants, but now it is obtained from sea salt or sodium chloride, which is a compound of the metal sodium with chlorine gas. In making soda ash, sulphuric acid is poured upon the salt, and the sulphur combining with the sodium forms sodium sulphate, or salt cake, which is the first step in the manufacture. But what becomes of the chlorine? It unites with the hydrogen of the acid (all true acids contain hydrogen), forming hydrochloric acid gas, or spirits of salt, which passes away in the shape of a white smoke. That is to say, it would so pass away if it were allowed to escape, and it did pass away at one time, to the annoyance and injury of all who lived near the factories, for the fumes are very powerful, and not only destroyed trees and grass and every green thing in the neighbourhood, but ruined the farmers and gardeners for some distance. Then taller chimneys were built to carry the fumes higher up, and so they did, but the gas was not destroyed, and simply came down again a little farther off than before, but with equally disastrous effects. This kind of thing, of course, could not be allowed to go on, and the next plan tried was turning the gas into the canals, where it was speedily absorbed by the water. But then there soon arose another outcry, for the people who owned barges complained that the gas made the iron rivets and nails come out of their boats. Finally, instead of being allowed to pollute the air or the canals, the gas was collected in a small quantity of water, and the Alkali Works Act was passed, compelling the manufacturers to condense it all and not suffer any to escape. And then it was discovered that this noxious matter might be converted into a valuable servant. Hitherto the only way of bleaching known had been by means of the sun and air, but now chlorine gas was found to be a very powerful bleacher, and was made to do the work instead. Quote, "By passing hydrochloric gas and air together over heated copper sulphate," end quote, the hydrogen of the one unites with the oxygen of the other to form water, and the chlorine is set free. Being wanted, however, in the form of a solid, not a gas, it is sent into lime, with which it forms the well-known bleaching powder chloride of lime, also much used as a disinfectant, which is worth £17 a ton. 200,000 tons of common salt are annually consumed in Great Britain for the preparation of nearly the same weight of soda ash, of which the value is about £2 million. And more than 1,000 tons of impure hydrochloric acid are produced every week in South Lancashire alone during the process, all of which was, until of late years, not merely wasted, but allowed to be positively destructive. The sulphur used in the process is still a waste product, and from its bad smell is a great nuisance, but no doubt in time some use will be found for this also. Another waste product which at present is allowed to be a general nuisance is the unconsumed carbon which escapes from our chimneys in the shape of finely divided soot or smoke. The weight of soot in the air on a winter day in London is estimated by Dr. Siemens at 50 tons, while of poisonous carbonic oxide there are 5 times as much, and the two together, quote, "destroy public monuments, waste life, sight, and cheerfulness," end quote, and deprive us of so much warmth. Mills, furnaces, factories, bakehouses, etc., are now obliged to consume their own smoke, and all that is needed in private houses is some means of subjecting the smoke to heat sufficient to consume it before allowing it to enter the chimney. It is said that smoke is a great disinfecting agent in populous towns, and as such it may be considered useful. But the same end might surely be attained in a civilized community by other means, without involving the present drawbacks of wasted time, smarting eyes, injured bronchial tubes, and defaced buildings. And what a wonderful difference it would make to the spirits of Londoners in general, to say nothing of the unfortunate artists, if the air were clear, the sun allowed to shine upon them whenever he would, and they themselves freed from the necessity of waging an incessant and more or less hopeless warfare with blacks. Nature consumes her own smoke, why should not we? Certainly the man who contrives to banish it from our towns and cities will deserve all the fortune he may be able to make out of it. Soot, we may remark, is looked down upon by dust. Nevertheless, in addition to what we pay to be delivered from it, soot is worth about 6d. a bushel, or a bushel of soot is reckoned equal in value to a quartern loaf. Its chief value as a manure arises from the sulphate of ammonia it contains, but the notion that the soot obtained from kitchen chimneys is superior to any other, owing to the fatty matters mixed with it, does not seem to have anything to warrant it. Grass which is manured with soot assumes a brighter green, and is much relished by cattle. At one time it was exported to the West India sugar plantations, and besides being applied to the soil, it is used for the manufacture of the brown colour called bistre, and for the colouring matter of paper hangings. Wood soot is said to be useful in hysteria and whooping cough. If we cannot at present collect and make use of the refuse which pollutes the air, we are at all events less helpless in the matter of that which accumulates in the streets, though even here our arrangements are far from perfect. Street dirt, or slop, as it is technically called when drained of its moisture, is sent off in barges to the brickmakers who live a few miles out of London. They pay nothing for it, and even receive it carriage free, because the contractor is obliged to get rid of it in one way or another, and there is no one on the spot to take it off his hands, though in the country the farmers would be glad to pay for it and fetch it at their own expense to put on the fields. Most of the street manure is now separated from the other sweepings, being collected by boys who dodge in and out among the horses and vehicles with great agility. But of all people on the face of the earth, the most thrifty in the matter of dealing with refuse certainly seem to be the Chinese, who waste not a scrap of any sort, and cultivate every inch of ground, as indeed they have every need to do, considering the millions for whom they have to provide food. Thrifty they are, but nice they are not, either in the original or acquired meaning of the word, at least in European eyes, and the odours which pervade their towns are terrible. They have no drains, and sewage and filth of all descriptions, together with every bit of organic matter which cannot be used for food, even by a Chinaman, are put into the large tubs which stand along each side of the street at intervals of a few feet. The contents are used for manuring the fields, and no Chinaman, it is said, thinks of returning home from an expedition to the town without filling the buckets which he carries slung at each end of a bamboo. Chinese barbers sell the hair of which they relieve their customers for manure, and a celebrated London barber told Mr. Buckland that, though now obliged to burn the cuttings of hair to get rid of them, when he was an apprentice in a country town, the sweepings of the shop were allowed to him as his perquisite, and he was in the habit of selling them at 6d. a bushel to a farmer, who said that the land thus manured with hair required nothing more for 3 years. In London, where people keep their hair short, it would take a long time to collect a bushel of clippings, but country customers often have long locks to part with. Human hair, by the by, is the strongest fibre known, and a rope made of it was shown in the Japanese court of the International Exhibition in 1862. The finest tresses used by hairdressers for making up into plaits, wigs, etc., come from the sisterhoods, and Paris seems to be the headquarters of the trade, as much as £140,000 being sold there in the year. Many years ago, pedlars, who went about the country in larger numbers than they do now, were in the habit of buying up hair, and have induced many a village lass to part with her beautiful locks for a trifle. One girl we know of allowed her luxuriant golden hair to be shorn off close to her head, and was satisfied to receive in return a brass thimble and a reel of cotton. In these days, or rather a few years ago, such hair would have been worth a good deal. But to return to the subject of manure. Dried hop bines are found useful for this purpose, as indeed one would expect. and the shells of crabs and lobsters, which accumulate in regular mountains where the canning business is carried on, are ground to powder and applied to the soil with some success. Better than lobster shells, however, is the refuse of the fish trade, large quantities of which are at present wasted, and might be had for the mere cost of collecting, as it is of little or no value. In cleaning cod for salting and drying, at least 1/2 of the weight of the fish is thrown away, to be food either for the gulls and other birds attendant on the fishermen, or for other fishes if thrown back into the sea. And as the French and Americans alone catch some 3,000,000 hundredweights of cod between them, the refuse must be enormous. At least 50,000 tons of animal matter must remain, too, after the seals have been deprived of their oil and skins. On some of the North American coasts the offal is simply burnt or thrown into the water as food for the bait fish. Some years ago even the livers of the cod were of next to no value in Newfoundland, the people not having the necessary appliances for extracting the oil. But the arrival of Mr. Fox, an English chemist, soon caused them to rise in price, and he also made known the value of the heads, which till then had been thrown into the sea or upon the manure heap. Mr. Fox obtained from them a large quantity of superior isinglass as well as glue. At the exhibition of 1862, M. Roard showed samples of fish manure from the Lofoten Isles, where he had collected heads and backbones, formerly wasted, and after drying them on the rocks in the wind and subjecting them to other processes, had reduced them to powder. He had also bought up the half-used livers, extracted the remainder of the oil, and converted the residue into manure. Boatloads of fish are often sold to put on the land at places on the coast, when the take happens to be unusually large and there is no other more remunerative market for it. Among the various kinds of refuse used as manure must be mentioned the damaged goods confiscated at many of the docks, which are buried until partly rotten before they are sold for this purpose. At the London docks, however, the goods are burnt and reduced to ashes, many tons of which are sold to the farmer. In the centre of these docks a fire is kept burning night and day, its chimney being known as the Queen's tobacco pipe, and here are consumed all condemned goods, some of them damaged and unfit for food, but many of such value that it is deeply to be regretted that some more rational method of disposing of them has not been devised. Great loads of tobacco and cigars are burnt from time to time, and a similar fate on one occasion befell 13,000 pairs of French gloves, while on another 900 Australian mutton hams were condemned to the flames. These hams had been warehoused on their arrival in the expectation that the duty on them would shortly be taken off, but they had to wait so long that they became damaged and were condemned as unfit for food. No doubt their ashes helped to enrich the fields, but the hams might have fed a large number of people, so that we can look at their consumption in this way only as a very wasteful proceeding. Even in their damaged state some were perfectly eatable, and many a slice was eaten by the man in charge of the furnace. Tea is now seldom burnt, having once set the chimney on fire, but cargoes of tea are sometimes condemned. Anyone walking down the Malu Road in Shanghai will see on either side trays of old tea leaves drying in the sun, and exposed not only to the dust, but to the attentions of the pigs, dogs, and children which play and walk about among them. Many tons of this Malu mixture, as it is called, are made and exported, and some of it is occasionally seized in London and properly condemned, for no one but the consignees could possibly grudge it to the fields. No doubt the waste from tomato canning went for manure until an enterprising American conceived the idea of turning it into tomato catsup, from which he realizes handsome profits, as he pays nothing for his material. The wholesale houses are no doubt glad to be rid of it, and to them he sends clean tubs to receive all the skins and parings. The tubs are removed every day, and the contents ground up, fermented, and flavoured. Jute refuse is another of the substances formerly considered fit only to rot and be applied to the soil, whereas now it is mixed with flax, hemp, and silk, and made into excellent paper. And a somewhat similar history may be told of the cotton seed, which was left to form offensive accumulations in some places, and in others given in small quantities to the cattle, or simply thrown away, or used as manure. Throwing away and using as manure are terms, by the by, which very often, though not always, mean the same thing in the end. But the cotton seed had a future before it, and what was a nuisance in 1824 was valuable property some years later, for in 1881 it was imported by England to the amount of 232,199 tons, the value of which was £1,783,109. It had been discovered, in the meantime, that cotton seed could be made to yield 19% of almost black oil, and that the residue made good cake for cattle. When refined, the oil is not inferior to fine colza, and is worth £29 a ton, but increases yet farther in value after it has made another journey, this time to the olive-growing districts of the south of Europe, where it is doctored and then reshipped to England as pure olive oil. Being almost tasteless, as well as nearly colourless, it is largely used for frying fish, packing sardines, etc. The inferior part of the oil yields hard grease or stearin, which is employed for soap making, and the husk of the seed is useful in paper making as well as for cake. Cotton stalks are now turned to much better account than formerly, a manufacturer of Brooklyn, New York, having perfected and patented a machine for reducing to fibre any material of a fibrous nature. This machine is now extensively worked in New York, and the cotton stalk fibre, originally intended for bagging, is now found to be much too valuable, and being almost like hemp, is used for better materials. The waste thrown out by the machine, the sticks and chips from the stalk, is more valuable as pulp for the manufacture of paper than any other substance yet discovered, and when mixed with cotton seed makes nourishing food for cattle or good manure. In America, no doubt, the supply of cotton stalks is abundant, but in Europe it would be a great boon to the manufacturers could they find some fibre which might be used with or instead of flax, and attempts are being made in Germany to utilise the nettle for this purpose. Nettle cloth is still the German name for muslin, and nettle fibre was largely used in the olden days before the introduction of cotton, as witness the nettle linen sheets and tablecloths used in Scotland early in the present century, and mentioned by the poet Campbell. What has been done once may be done again, and if manufacturers could be found to buy the fibre or stalks, no doubt many a waste piece of ground might be made to grow nettles with advantage, for it is a crop which requires little care and is said never to fail. Cotton waste, which used to be employed for paper making, is now made into wadding, lamp wicks, common carpets, and twine. It is also used for cleaning machinery, and is no longer burnt or thrown away even after it has served this purpose, as was formerly the case, for it has been found possible to clean it, and both the cotton and the dirty oil with which it is saturated may be used again. The lubricating oil used for machinery is also now regularly collected and cleaned. While on the subject of oil, we may mention that petroleum casks are collected by costermongers at 4d. apiece from the oil shops, taken to the waterside, and sold for reshipment to America. Among the other waste products from which oil is obtained may be mentioned grape seeds, which, though for the most part still wasted, have been long used for this purpose in Italy, the Levant, and part of Germany. 2 casks of seeds yield 33 pounds of oil, which when purified is equal to olive, while the residue makes good soap, and the refuse of the seeds is used as fuel. The seeds are also valuable for fining and strengthening wine. Argol, a crude variety of cream of tartar, which forms a crust in wine vats and bottles, is also obtained from grape skins and refuse grapes, and from it is made tartaric acid, which is largely used in calico printing as well as for making lemonade. When the argol has been extracted, the remaining refuse is made to yield gas and coke. But there are still other sources of oil which must not be passed over. Orange peel, of which enormous quantities are wasted, i.e. cleared away with the street sweepings, contains much oil which is easily expressed and often used for making soap and scent. At some of the theatres and music halls, where oranges are largely consumed by the audience, the peel is collected and sold. Sawdust also yields oil, as well as spirit, oxalic acid, charcoal, and potash. And from the oil and potash together, soap is obtained. Immense quantities of sawdust are produced in the great sawmills of the United States, Canada, and Norway, and except being used for packing, for sprinkling floors, and for smoking fish, as litter for horses, and for mixing with fish refuse as manure, nothing more used to be done with it. The sawdust is, however, much more valuable now that the various substances above mentioned can be produced from it, and at one mill in Norway 2 horses are constantly employed in removing it. From 900 weights of sawdust, over 19.5% of grape sugar is obtained, and from this brandy is manufactured. But the Paris cabinet makers have invented a way of using the sawdust itself. By subjecting it to enormous pressure and intense heat, they convert it into a solid mass which can take a brilliant surface, and which they call bois durci, or tough wood. The dust of mahogany, birch, and rosewood is used for cleaning and dressing furs, boxwood dust for cleaning jewellery, and the shavings made in the shaping of cedar pencils yield otto of cedar wood in the proportion of 28 ounces to the hundredweight. The dust made by ivory turners is sold at 6d. a pound, and when boiled down makes the finest and purest animal jelly. Ivory dust jelly was at one time a fashionable remedy in cases of weakness, and Mr. Buckland was of opinion that it only needed to be tried to convince people of its virtues. There is, at all events, nothing objectionable about it, which is more than can be said for the red currant jelly, which, as well as rum, the Americans are declared to fabricate from old boots. Dye wood residues, that is, wood shavings from which the best of the dye has been extracted, give a solution which is useful for tanning and also to a certain extent for dyeing, but the insoluble remainder was worth but a few shillings a ton, and was in most cases thrown away, the only use to which it could be put being to burn as fuel when mixed with tar refuse, until a French chemist began to convert it into paper pulp. Rough kinds of grey and brown paper are also made from the shoots of hops left after the cutting down of the bines. Dried hop bines are a valuable manure, and even the spent hops, those which have been used in the making of beer, are found when dried to make good litter, and are said to improve the health of the horses. The rest of the brewer's refuse, namely the spent malt, called draff or dreg, being more than the cows could eat, was in Edinburgh thrown into the Leith, until an outcry was raised against the practice, when the brewers found that by pressing the draff into cake they could sell it to farmers at a distance and put £60 a week in their own pockets. During the cattle plague, however, it was again thrown on their hands, and for a while they paid to get rid of it, until it was found that by drying it could be converted into good food for horses. Glycerine is another of the now valuable waste products once looked upon as worse than useless and thrown away. It is contained in most oils and fats, both animal and vegetable, and is formed during the process of soap making. It is now largely used in medicine, for the production of syrups, etc., for extracting perfumes, making confectionery, and as a preserver. In the United States it is also used for charging gas meters, £2,000,000 being thus consumed annually. In conclusion, a few words must be devoted to metal refuse, and as the fashion of wearing crinoline periodically threatens to become general, we may begin by mentioning that crinoline steels are an awkward kind of refuse with which no one cares to deal. The chiffonniers reject them, the dustmen do not like them, and when the fashion was declining some years ago, it is said that numbers were thrown into the streets of New York and other towns where they were not only a nuisance but dangerous, both to foot passengers and horses. Yet enormous quantities of steel must be used in their manufacture, and this, of course, could be melted down. The monument to Horace Greeley, the founder of the New York Tribune, is cast out of many thousands of pounds of old type contributed by the printers of the United States. The scrap iron, or rather steel, left over from needle making, being of the finest quality, is used for making gun barrels. The waste from the steel pens made in Birmingham is sold to Sheffield at £10 a ton, the original price having been £50 or £60, and is there remelted. Steel filings are bought by chemists for the manufacture of steel wine. Old ship's copper and copper scraps of all kinds are first converted into oxide by heat, and then dissolved in sulphuric acid, forming sulphate of copper, which crystallises in large blue crystals and is commonly known as blue vitriol, which is largely used in calico printing and the manufacture of various pigments, such as Shaler's green. Copper pyrites, or sulphide of copper, is used for the same purpose, and as small quantities of gold and silver are frequently associated with this ore, the residue from the pyrites kilns in vitriol factories is found to yield both these metals as well as copper. Gold and silver to the value of £3,232 have been obtained from 16,300 tons. Silver nitrate, or lunar caustic, as it is called when cast into sticks, is, as is well known, used in photography, and from defective pictures, clippings, sweepings, and washings, one firm has recovered 2 bars of silver worth £44. A carpet which covered the floor of one of the rooms in the Mint of San Francisco for 5 years was, when taken up, cut in small pieces and burnt in pans, with the result that its ashes yielded gold and silver to the value of $2,500. From the silver found on the copper sheathing of a ship, it has been calculated that there must be about 200 million tons dissolved in the waters of the ocean, while of gold it is thought there must be 1 grain in every ton of water. Both these metals must, we suppose, have been carried into the sea by the rivers, but no practical way of recovering them has been invented. We have already noticed the large number of particles of steel and iron in the dust of railway carriages, but though less obvious, there must also be great quantities in the dust of our streets, worn from wheel tires, horseshoes, and the nails in our boots. Some day, perhaps, it will be found possible and profitable to extract this metal before the mud is sent off to farmers and brickmakers. In smelting impure ore, some other mineral is melted with it to form what is called a flux. Thus iron ore is melted with limestone, and the lime combining with the silica of the ore sets the iron free. The silicate of lime thus produced is called slag, and great hills of it are often to be seen in the neighbourhood of smelting furnaces. Sometimes it is crushed and used for concrete walls, but large quantities now lying idle might be employed for making by-roads, for foundations, macadamising, and as railway ballast. Of late, however, it has been applied to a novel purpose. Air is blown into it while it is in a molten state, and the effect is to draw it out into exceedingly fine fibres, as fine as the finest spun glass and as soft as cotton. It is, in fact, a species of glass, though no one would guess it from its original appearance, and it is used for covering boilers. In the Sandwich Islands the birds make their nests of a similar substance, made not by any artificial means, but by the great volcano, Mauna, which churns its molten lava so violently that the spray is dashed high in the air, and, cooling as it falls, forms threads of fine spun green glass, called by the natives Pele's hair, which drifts away with the wind and hangs in masses about the trees and rocks. End of The World's Lumber Room, a gossip about some of its contents, by Selina GAYE. Recording by Ruth Golding, 2012. golding.wordpress.com